Before we dive into the technical material, let's get some Alteryx-related terminology straight. First of all, Alteryx is the name of a US-based software company. Alteryx, the company, makes the software Alteryx Designer, and that software is the subject of this course. Alteryx Designer is frequently referred to as Alteryx or Designer for short, and I'll use these same abbreviated naming conventions throughout this course. In summary, and of course it depends on the context, but when I use the term Alteryx, I'm almost always referring to the software and not the company. I think it's also important to note that the capabilities of Alteryx and Excel are frequently compared to each other. Now, I want to get into the technical aspects of Alteryx as quickly as I can because, that's why you're here. But I think before we take a deeper dive into Alteryx, it's worth saying a few words about this kind of comparison. Because sometimes you'll hear things that go something like this. Wait, you're still using Excel? Seriously? You know that was invented in the 20th century, right? What are you, some kind of dinosaur or something? I don't personally buy that kind of mentality, and here's why. Imagine you're playing CPA golf and you have two clubs in your bag. One is Excel and the other is Alteryx. Now, taking this analogy a little further, let's say that Alteryx is best for dealing with large amounts of data. In other words, Alteryx is like your driver, and Excel is better for customized precision work, meaning Excel is your putter. Can you see based on this example that it's silly to argue about which one of these software golf clubs is better? Are you really going to hit off the tee with your putter? And are you really going to putt with your driver? In other words, are you going to try to use the same software tool to accomplish all that you have to do as a CPA? That just doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is recognizing that Alteryx and Excel have different strengths, which make them suited for different tasks. So wrapping this up, if you're talking to me as a CPA and you're telling me that Alteryx is great, then my response is, hey, that's awesome. Show me how I can use it to be more effective in creating CPA-related work products. But if you come to me and tell me how great Alteryx is, and because of that, then I should ditch that old-fashioned Excel, then my answer is going to be something like this. Sure, now that I've learned about Alteryx, I'm ready to give up Excel right now. When you pry it out of my cold, dead hands. That's right, I'm telling you as one CPA to another and as one who knows Alteryx and who's used it on large Fortune 500 projects. I'm never, ever going to give up Excel. So the bottom line is this. Alteryx and Excel are both valuable tools for accounting, tax, and finance professionals. For that reason, as we go through this material, don't think of me as trying to convince you to use Alteryx as a replacement for Excel. Instead, I'm going to show you what Alteryx can do in the context of examples that we deal with as CPAs. And as you better understand its strengths and capabilities, you'll have one more software club in your bag in addition to Excel and many other software tools that you can use to tackle the challenges that we face in our profession. So with that as background, let's go ahead and dive into the technical aspects of how to use Alteryx. Even though you may not know a lot about Alteryx yet, you've likely heard that it's extremely good at handling large amounts of data. Well, I would agree. But here's the thing. Nothing happens in Alteryx until you import your data into the software program. Once you do that, then you can use Alteryx tools to work with your data in the ways that are necessary to accomplish your goals. This is where the input data tool comes in. It's extremely important because it allows you to import data into Alteryx from external files and other sources. Now, let's start off with a simple but important example to show how this works. What you're looking at on the screen is entirely fictional sales data. For purposes of our example, we're going to say that you've exported this sales data from your ERP system to an Excel file. Now, we'll assume that because this is a raw data dump, it's kind of a mess, and that means it needs a fair amount of cleanup before you can efficiently work with it to do the kinds of calculations that you want to do. In addition, after cleaning it up, You need to manipulate this data in some fairly complicated ways in order to perform the accounting, tax, or financial calculations that you're aiming to do. In your case, you quickly realize that to do both of these tasks, cleaning up the data and then manipulating and organizing it in the way that you need to perform your calculations would be a very time-consuming and manual process if you used Excel. As a result, you decide that Alteryx would be a better tool to do the job. And that means you need to import this sales data in your Excel file into Alteryx. There are two ways to do this. The first I'll refer to as the standard method, and the second I'll refer to as the shortcut method. We'll first go over the standard method. To import the sales data using this method, click on the Input Data tool in the Tool palette and drag it to the canvas. Now, in saying that, I know I just used some terms that you're not familiar with, and I'm going to cover what they mean in a minute. But for now, to import your sales data, drag the Input Data tool to the large blank area on the screen, which is referred to as the canvas. From the Input Data tool's configuration window, which is another term I'll cover shortly, click on the arrow in the section Connect a File or Database. Click on Files. Click Select File. Drill down to the file location where you saved the sales data that you want to import into Alteryx. Double-click on the sales data file. Now we come to an important option. Here you want to select the sheet within the Excel workbook that you want to import into Alteryx. This highlights a very important limitation of the Input Data tool, and that's that you can only import one Excel worksheet at a time. For example, if you take a closer look at our sales data, you'll notice the Excel workbook has two tabs. So here, we need to tell Alteryx which of those two worksheets that we want to import into the software program. Now you may think this is kind of a pain, and whether you do or you don't, that's obviously up to you. But what I can tell you is that on most all projects I've worked on so far, this limitation hasn't been that big of a deal to me for one of two reasons. The first is there are many times when I've used Alteryx where I've only needed data from a single Excel worksheet. And even in situations where I've needed data from multiple Excel worksheets for the same project, which is something that happens all the time, that's easy to deal with because you can use multiple Input Data tools to import the Excel worksheets that you need to into Alteryx. So getting back to our example, if you want to import the second set of sales data from the Excel workbook into the canvas, you would drag another Input Data tool onto the canvas, and when you arrive here, you would select the other worksheet. Now that you know how to import data from Excel into Alteryx using the standard method, let's go over the shortcut method. First, find the Excel workbook that contains your sales data. Next, drag the Excel file to the canvas. Now you're at the menu where you select the Excel worksheet that you want to import. And from this point, you follow the procedures we just went over to import the Excel worksheet that contains your raw sales data into Alteryx. Finally, for information, I personally almost always use the shortcut method when importing Excel data into Alteryx. Now that you've imported your data into Alteryx, so what? What does that even mean? It means that you can now use the full array of Alteryx's tools to cleanse, organize, and manipulate your data so that you can perform accounting, tax, and finance computations more quickly and with a higher degree of confidence and precision than was previously possible than using Excel by itself. To understand and get the most out of the uses and capabilities of Alteryx's tools, it's important to go over the various sections of Alteryx Designer's main screen. As I do so, notice there's an artistic theme that plays into some of the naming conventions for the various areas in Designer. For example, the tool palette is at the top of the screen. It contains the full library of Alteryx tools that are used to work with your data. What you see here are tools that have been selected as favorites, which you can tell by the gold star at the top right of the tool. The canvas is in the middle of the screen. This is where you drag tools from the tool palette to create workflows. I'll explain the concept of a workflow a little later on. After you drag a tool to the canvas, you need to configure it to interact with your data in the way that you intend. You configure a tool by clicking on it. After doing so, options for that tool will appear in what's called the configuration window, which is on the left side of the screen. It's here in the configuration window that you customize Alteryx tools to meet your needs. And this is one of the best features of Alteryx, to be able to customize data analysis with visual tools and menus rather than having to learn software code. It's important to note that each tool's configuration window is different because each tool does different things. And of course, I'll walk you through various tools as we progress through the material. What you see here is called the workflow configuration. You see this when there are no tools on the canvas or when you click on a blank area of the canvas rather than on a tool. You can use this menu to control the various ways in which Alteryx works. That said, in working on accounting and tax projects, I haven't yet found it necessary to make adjustments to the default configuration. Let's talk about the Run button for a minute. Think of the raw data in your Excel worksheet like water behind a dam. When you release water from a dam, it goes wherever you design for it to go based on how you engineered the river channel. Likewise, when you click on the Run button, your data is released into Alteryx and it travels through each tool you placed on the canvas. This essentially describes the concept of a workflow. Your data travels from left to right, and as it passes through each tool, it's modified or otherwise impacted by that tool based on how you configured it to interact with your data. The results window is at the bottom of the screen, below the canvas. After you click on the Run button, Alteryx processes your data based on how you configured the various tools in your workflow. And the results window is where you see what your data looks like at the end of that process. This and other concepts will become clearer as we add more tools to the canvas and we see how they impact our sales data. Previously, I talked about the purpose of Alteryx in fancier terms, meaning that we were going to use it to organize, modify, format, clean, manipulate, and analyze our data according to our needs using a variety of Alteryx tools. But let's talk about what that means in simpler terms. To do that, let's go back to our sales data. What we would like to do is use this sales data in accounting, tax, or financial calculations. That's it. That's what we're trying to do. And by default, and this is kind of funny because you're in this course, but we would rather not use Alteryx at all. In other words, it would be best and most efficient if we could just export financial data from our ERP system into Excel and do the calculations we wanted right away. But what we're assuming in our example is that we can't do that. Why not? There could be a lot of reasons. The numbers are formatted as text. There are numerous columns that contain data we don't need. There might be tens of thousands of extra rows that don't factor into our calculations, and the list of issues could go on. The point is, we're assuming in this example that our sales data is a mess, and not only would fixing the data in Excel be a time-consuming and manual process, but working with the data manually would make it hard to document our process for SOX purposes, and would also increase the possibility of making an error. As a result, what we're about to use Alteryx for is to take messy sales data in Excel, organize it in a methodical way that meets our needs, and then we're going to export the cleaned up data to a separate Excel file so that we can do our accounting, tax, or financial calculations. That's really it. That's why we're using Alteryx, to clean up our data for Excel calculations. With these principles in mind, let's take the next step in organizing our data by starting with the top section and methodically working our way from there. This brings us to an important reality, which is that data rarely comes into Alteryx exactly the way we want it to. And specifically, a common problem when importing data into Alteryx is there are unnecessary and/or empty rows at the top of a data set. As an example, Consider a sales report that looks like this in Excel. Here we need the core data that's shown in columns and rows. But we don't need the extraneous data at the top of the data set. This is further made clear after you use the Input Data tool to import the sales data into Alteryx. After you click the Run button, take a look at how the top section of your data looks in the Results window. This isn't at all what you want. For example, instead of the heading of your first column being Transaction Date, it's Sales Report for Company X. Also, the headings for your other columns, which are referred to as fields in Alteryx, have generic headings such as F2, F3, and so on. Finally, we have null or empty values in our top few rows. Addressing these issues is a process, and that process starts with the Select Records tool. Before going further, let me point out that the Select Records tool doesn't appear in the Favorites section of the tool palette by default. To add it, go to the blue Preparation section of the tool palette, the color that corresponds to the color of the tool. Once there, you'll locate the Select Records tool. Then, if it doesn't already have a gold star beside it, you'll click on the upper right-hand side of the tool to give it one, and then it will appear in your Favorites menu. Likewise, to remove a tool from your Favorites menu, you'll uncheck the gold star associated with it. To find and use that tool again, you would need to go to the appropriate menu section in the tool palette. Now that you know how to add and remove tools from the Favorites menu, let's go back to the Select Records tool. To start the process of cleaning up our data, we'll drag the Select Records tool to the canvas and place it next to the Input Data tool. And specifically, we'll drag it so the left input anchor of the Select Records tool connects to the right output anchor of the Input Data tool. If this doesn't happen automatically, you can connect the tools manually by dragging from one tool's anchor to the other, or you can move the Select Records tool closer to the Input Data tool. Once the tools are connected with a black line, that means they're, quote, talking to each other. In other words, it means that once the raw Excel data comes into Alteryx through the Input Data tool, it will then flow to the Select Records tool. This same concept applies to all tools. You need to make sure they're connected to each other as signified by a black line between them, or there will be a break in your workflow. Getting back to our example, after the Select Records tool is on the canvas, click on it to bring up its configuration window. Here's a closer look at the tool's configuration options. At the top, you see examples of how the tool can be configured, and for the moment, the tool is currently configured with a range of -100. To clarify what these sample configuration settings mean, the following is what would appear in the results window after you ran the workflow. With -2, you would see only the first two rows of the incoming sales data from the Excel file. With 3, out of the entire incoming data set, only row 3 would be displayed. With 17 through 20, only rows 17 through 20 of the sales data would display, but nothing else. 50 plus would display the imported data starting from row 50. -100 means only the first 100 lines of the incoming data would display. In our example, none of the configuration options on the previous slide is exactly what we're looking for, but the 50 plus option was the closest. In other words, rather than skipping the first 50 lines of the sales data imported into Alteryx from the Input Data tool, we want our cleaned up data set to start with the row containing the names transaction date, product, price, and so on. Accomplishing this is trickier than it first appears, and here's one of the reasons why. First, note that the column descriptions in the original Excel source data appear on row 5. However, if you click on the Input Data tool and look at the Preview pane in the configuration window, you'll see the column descriptions begin in row 4. So the question is this: what determines how the Select Records tool should be configured? The column heading's position in the original source file, which is row 5 in our Excel spreadsheet, or its position in the Input Data tool, which we can see here is row 4. The answer is that Designer looks to the data's position in the Input Data tool. With that in mind, if we configure the Select Records tool with 4+, after we run the workflow, here's the data we'll see displayed in the results window. What you see here is definitely an improvement. We've gotten rid of extraneous rows at the top of our data, and the transaction date and other column descriptions now appear in line 1. However, there's still a problem. Being in the row labeled 1 means Alteryx is reading our column descriptions as data and not as column headers. In other words, the column headers in our data right now are currently sales report for company X, F2, F3, and so on. How do we fix this? How do we get Alteryx to use the row we want to properly populate or appear as column or field names? To do this, we're going to need to add another tool to the workflow called Dynamic Rename. On my screen, the Dynamic Rename tool is in the Favorites menu, but like the Select Records tool, it doesn't start out there by default. This means to use the Dynamic Rename tool, you first need to find it, which isn't obvious. The Dynamic Rename tool is located in the Developer section of the tool palette. But if you take a look, you might say, wait a minute, I don't see a Developer section in the tool palette. That's because it doesn't fit on most screens. To get there, you need to click the arrow at the far right of the tool palette. After clicking on it multiple times, you'll see the Developer section. After clicking on the Developer section, you'll see the Dynamic Rename tool. Because it's a bit of a pain to find, once you do, I recommend you check the gold star beside it to make it a favorite. Now let's return to what we were aiming to do in the first place, which is to move the column descriptions from the Data section to the Field Names section. To accomplish this, follow these steps. Drag the Dynamic Rename tool to the canvas and place it to the right of the Select Records tool. Note that the Select Records tool should automatically connect to the left input anchor of the Dynamic Rename tool, and the left input anchor I'm referring to is marked with an L. From here, we need to configure the Dynamic Rename tool. To do so, click on it. In the Rename Mode section of the tool's configuration window, find the drop-down arrow. You'll now note that there's no drop-down arrow visible in the Rename Mode section. This highlights the fact that you can resize the windows in Alteryx's main screen to best meet your needs. For example, if you need to see more of a tool's configuration window, then you can expand it. Likewise, if you need to see more or less of the canvas, you can adjust the sizing of the results window as well. Now that we have a full view of the configuration window of the Dynamic Rename tool, we can see the down arrow we were looking for earlier in the Rename Mode section. From there, select the option Take Field Names from the first row of data. After doing this, you'll see check marks appear in the boxes Sales Report for Company X, F1, F2, etc. These are the current names of the existing fields in our data. And remember, the term fields is frequently used in Alteryx to refer to columns, which is something that takes some getting used to if you're a heavy Excel user like most CPAs are. Moving on, the check marks mean that each of these fields or columns will be replaced by the information that appears in the first row of our data, which in our case are the column names that we want, such as transaction date, product, price, and so on. After clicking Run to process the workflow, you'll see the following results. We've now reached an important point. Because we've taken the first steps of taking control of our data, which was using Alteryx to automate the process of 1, removing unwanted rows at the beginning of the raw sales data, and 2, using information that already existed in our original Excel worksheet to properly name our columns. And all of this is good, but it's missing a crucial element of why we chose to use Alteryx in the first place. Remember from the first part of our example, we said that we had raw, messy sales data that we exported from our ERP system to Excel. Our goal was to use Alteryx to cleanse and organize the data so that we could then use the cleaned up version to perform accounting, tax, or financial calculations. So that begs the question, now that we've successfully used Alteryx to organize our sales data in the way that we want it, how do we get it out of Alteryx and back into an Excel format? The answer is that we're going to use the output data tool, which is what we're going to cover next. Drag the output data tool from the tool palette to the canvas and place it next to the dynamic rename tool. After doing so, configure the output data tool by clicking on it. From there, in the output data tool's configuration window, click on the down arrow in the section Write to File or Database to select where you want to save your cleaned up and organized sales data. This is done as follows. From this point, click Files if it's not already selected. Click Microsoft Excel to save your cleaned up sales data as an Excel file. Navigate to the folder 5.2 Output Data. In the file name field, type Clean Sales Data. And after you click Save, you'll get the option to specify a sheet. Type Sales Summary. After you click OK, it's important to recognize that nothing has happened yet. You haven't actually saved anything. What you've done up to this point is to configure the output data tool to save an Excel file named Clean Sales Data to the file path you specified. Further, when you open the Excel file, the updated sales data will be on a single tab named Sales Summary. All of this will happen after you click Run to run your workflow. To sum up the process, your raw sales data is going to come into Alteryx via the Input Data tool. And after your data is transformed by the Select Records and Dynamic Rename tools, the Output Data tool will export it to a new Excel file named Clean Sales Data. You can then open the cleaned up Excel file to do your accounting, tax, or financial calculations. Before going on, I want to reemphasize something because it's a crucial point to understand as a CPA that uses Alteryx. Despite all we've done in Alteryx so far, our original raw Excel sales data, the file name Sales Jan 2009, remains untouched. I know, 2009 is way back when, but we're just going to roll with it. No, the more important thing to notice is how your cleaned up sales data is in an entirely new and different Excel workbook called Clean Sales Data. This is vital because it means you can use Alteryx to do anything to your data that you want, but the source data file always remains untouched, and that's an extremely important point to understand from a preparer, reviewer, audit, and SOX control standpoint. Also, I've alluded to this before, but at this point you've hit a major milestone in your growing knowledge of Alteryx. You've completed your first workflow. Exactly what does that mean? I define a complete workflow process as follows. You import data into Alteryx, you modify, analyze, and organize that data according to your needs using various Alteryx tools, and finally, you export that data to a file format that meets your needs. Import, modify, export. That's what a workflow is all about. Most all workflows, whether they contain 3 tools or 300, follow this simple pattern. This concept has powerful and exciting implications. It means that now you truly know how to create Alteryx workflows. And that means from this point, you can now broaden your knowledge of the Alteryx tools available to use, delve more deeply into how to use these tools effectively and with a greater degree of precision and expertise. And finally, you'll be able to successfully address and resolve progressively more varied and sophisticated data-related challenges. In addition, and I think this is important to talk about, by using Alteryx, you can have a deeper sense of professional fulfillment along the way because it's far more interesting and engaging to resolve data-related challenges by applying Alteryx's tools coupled with your own thinking and logic versus dealing with the same issues using the brute force of manual and tedious manipulation in Excel spreadsheets. Now, at this point, you might be thinking all that sounds great as far as soaring rhetoric is concerned, but perhaps you're not completely buying it. Why might that be? Well, think about what we've accomplished so far using Alteryx. All we've done is delete a few rows at the top of an Excel spreadsheet. That's it. In other words, if we just open the raw Excel sales data file and go to the top row and click delete rows 4 times, we get to the same place we did going through all the steps in Alteryx that we've covered up to this point. If that's the case, is using Alteryx even worth it? Or is it a total waste of time if you're an experienced Excel user? Addressing our specific example, I 100% agree that if all you need to do is delete a few rows at the top of a spreadsheet, you would never use Alteryx to do that. That's something you would just take a few seconds to do in Excel and then you would move on from there. No, the bigger issue that's important to grasp is this. By importing raw Excel data into Alteryx, we were able to configure various tools to modify that data exactly how we wanted. And then with just a push of a button, we were able to export that data to a clean Excel file for use in calculations without ever touching our source data. That's pretty incredible. So while it's true that we've only made modest changes to our sales data so far, changes that would be quick and easy using Excel alone, we've only scratched the surface of what Alteryx can do and how fast and precisely it can do it. All you need now is to learn how to use a broader array of Alteryx tools, as well as the knowledge of how to expertly configure those tools. And once you've got that, the sky's the limit. With these thoughts in mind, you might want to start learning new Alteryx tools right away. And I can certainly appreciate that, and we're going to get there if you stay with me. But before covering more tools, I believe it's vital to strengthen your foundational knowledge of how Alteryx works. Specifically, I think it's important to revisit Alteryx's main screen and to explore the various sections in a greater degree of detail. A more in-depth understanding of the various sections of Alteryx's main screen will enhance your effectiveness with all Alteryx tools, including the ones you've already learned. And that, in turn, will help you to work through data-related challenges with greater knowledge, speed, confidence, and precision. So far, you're only familiar with the tools that I've presented to you. Of course, I'll be showing you more tools as we progress through other courses, and in particular, my focus will be on tools that I believe matter the most to CPAs. That said, while we're all accounting, tax, and finance professionals who share many commonalities in our work, we still have a significant amount of variability in our areas of specialization, our industries, and our companies. Because of this, I believe it's worth it for you to take some time on your own to go beyond the tools that are listed in the Favorites section and to explore different tool palette categories such as in-out, preparation, join, and so on. By doing this, you'll likely get ideas that will help you to tailor your learning of Alteryx in a way that makes you more effective in your specific roles and responsibilities. Note that as you review the names of Alteryx tools, you'll notice that many are intuitive, but there are also many that aren't. Either way, you can learn more about a tool by right-clicking on it while it's still in the tool palette. From there, click Help to read a description of the tool, what it does, and how it works. You can also click on Open Example. Here, click on the Run button, and you'll see multiple examples of how the tool you're exploring impacts data in actual workflows. For a hands-on visual learner like me, this section is extremely helpful, and it's given me a lot of good ideas. Switching gears, let's briefly talk about tabs. Similar to the way internet browser tabs work, you can have more than one workflow open at a time. Click on the tabs to alternate back and forth between various workflows. Let's take a closer look at the drop-down menus. Use the File section to open, save, and even print workflows. File Open Recent is also a handy way for quickly opening a workflow you were in recently. The Edit section contains commands such as cut, copy, and paste, but in practice, much of that is done by right-clicking as well as using the Control shortcuts as shown on the screen. The View section allows you to control what sections you see on the screen. For example, you could hide the results window if you wanted more screen space devoted to your actual workflow. While it's certainly nice to have this option, I rarely use it in practice. I find it useful to have all of the areas of the Alteryx screen in view. Among other things, the Options menu allows you to adjust your user settings. That was obviously a quick overview of the drop-down menus, and you're certainly welcome to go over them in more detail on your own. But I'll just tell you from a practical perspective, as I've used Alteryx on large projects, I haven't needed to go much deeper into the drop-down menus than what I just showed you. Moving on, you can adjust the size of the tools in your workflow by clicking the plus and minus buttons below the Run button. If you make your tools larger, or as your workflows grow in size and sophistication, they may not fit on the screen. When this happens, notice that navigation bars appear to the right and at the bottom of the canvas so that you can scroll to the area where you need to work. Also, after clicking anywhere on the canvas, you can use the wheel on your mouse to scroll up and down within a workflow. We're now going to talk about following data through your workflow as it passes through tools. Up to this point, it's possible you may have had the mistaken impression that after you click Run to process your workflow, you can only see in the results window what your data looks like in its final form. That's not at all the case. In fact, you can see how Alteryx tools impact your data as it passes through each step of the workflow. Taking a closer look at the tools on the canvas, notice that the Input Data tool has a small yellowish-green arrow on its right side. These are referred to as anchors, which is a term I used earlier. Anchors that appear on the left side of tools are called input anchors, and anchors that appear on the right side of tools are known as output anchors. And some tools, such as Dynamic Rename, have more than one input or output anchor. Here's the key. After you run a workflow, if you click on a tool's input anchor, in the results window you can see how the data looks as it came into the tool, before it was modified or otherwise impacted by that tool based on its configuration. And if you click on a tool's output anchor, then you can see what the tool did to the data, which is the form it will take as it makes its way to the next tool in the workflow. Notice how the Input Data tool has an output anchor but no input anchor. This is because it imports raw data into Alteryx without modification. The Output Data tool is just the opposite. It has an input anchor but not an output anchor. That's because this tool's job isn't to modify data, it's only there to export data you've modified using other tools to a file format you can use, such as an Excel file. The point of all this is that the transformation of your data in a workflow doesn't have to be some kind of mystical process. As I've shown, you can review what happens to your data every step of the way by clicking on the input and output anchors of the various tools and evaluating the output in the results window. Once you believe your workflow is processing correctly, then as a final check, You can open the output file, meaning the Excel file you exported in our example, to do a more complete review prior to using that cleaned up data in your calculations. Let's review the results window in greater detail. After you run your workflow, there's a lot of useful information here that we'll now cover. An important function of the results window is to give you more insight into what's causing errors in your workflow. If you think of a workflow as water flowing through a channel, you can think of an error as something that's creating a blockage in that channel, preventing the water, or data in our case, from reaching its destination, which in our example is the output data tool. To illustrate this, let's run our workflow. Notice the red exclamation point on the screen. This indicates there's an error with the Select Records tool. The first error message in red offers a clue in its use of the term empty expression. When you click on the Select Records tool to investigate further, you see a more simplified view in the results window. In other words, you only see information on the error being triggered by the tool. Second, notice how clicking the Select Records tool brought up its configuration window. After looking over it more carefully, you notice that the ranges section is blank. Now the empty expression error makes more sense. In short, the ranges section of the Select Records tool must be populated or it will trigger an error in the workflow. After you do so and click the Run button, your workflow will process error-free. As you can see, even on this simple workflow, the results window can get busy with a lot of information. To simplify its presentation, you can click on the Errors button to see only the error messages generated by your workflow. This same view simplification concept applies to all the buttons in the Results window section: conversion errors, warnings, messages, and so on. Speaking of warning messages, let's briefly cover what those mean. As you've seen, by default, errors stop your workflow until you fix them, but warnings do not. If you run a workflow and get a warning, consider it as a kind of heads up from Alteryx that it's found a potential item to note, or maybe it thinks it's detecting some type of inconsistency in your data. Warnings are very common, particularly as workflows get larger and more complex. For my part, as a practical matter, while I might take a look at warnings, if my output's being transformed as I intended, I don't really spend a lot of time worrying about them. After you click on a tool, such as the Dynamic Rename tool, you'll see depictions of its corresponding anchors in the Results window. Specifically, you can see left and right input anchors at the top and the tool's output anchor below. If you click on the left input anchor in the Results window, you'll see a display of what the data looks like coming into the Dynamic Rename tool. If you click on the right input anchor, then the screen will be blank because you can see from the canvas that there's no data flowing into it. When you click on the output anchor in the Results window, you'll see what the data looks like after it's been modified by the tool. Clicking on the Messages button will display any messages generated by a tool after the workflow has been run. Now let's look at the Data and Metadata buttons. When the Data button is highlighted, the results of your data will appear in the Results window. That's pretty straightforward. Metadata, on the other hand, is a different concept. Metadata is often defined as data or information about the data itself. Clicking on this button will display the characteristics of the data within a given tool. As previously noted, the quote, perfect way to evaluate whether your data output is correct is to export it and review it in full. However, that can take some time and it's often unnecessary. In many cases, a quick review of the data in the Results window will tell you if you're on the right track in designing your workflow to meet your needs. However, to verify your data is being organized and handled as you intended, sometimes you need to see it in a more intuitive format than what's presented by default in the Results window. One quick thing you can do to get more insight into your data is to sort or filter it in the Results window. You can do this by hovering over the column heading that you're interested in and clicking the three dots. There you'll see options for sorting or filtering based on the data in that column. When you're done, click the X within the Sort Filter section and your data will return to normal. Other items to note are if you rerun your workflow, then all sorting and filtering will be removed. Also, sorting and filtering only affect what you see in the results window. It does not impact your underlying data. Let's talk about the importance of experimentation when using Alteryx. If you recall, when we configured the Select Records tool, there was a question about whether 4+ or 5+ was the right configuration to put in the ranges section. The question is, what if you get it wrong? And the answer is that it doesn't matter. Why not? For one thing, remember what I told you before. No matter what you do to your data in Alteryx, it doesn't change the source data file. In other words, our raw sales data in Excel remains untouched. Further, if we remove the output data tool from the canvas, then our data isn't going anywhere. In other words, our workflow isn't exporting our data to create a new Excel file. And even if it did, we could keep writing over that file until we were happy with it. What all this means is that you're free to experiment with your workflow by running it all you want. And by doing so, you're not, quote, hurting anything. Your source data remains unchanged, and the cleaned up sales data you export to Excel isn't final until you say it is. Let's see what this looks like by way of an example. First, we'll assume we mistakenly configured the Select Records tool with 5+. After running the workflow, we check the result as it comes out of the Dynamic Rename tool. Here we see this isn't at all what we wanted. Instead of our field names being transaction date, product, price, and so on, our column headers are actually being populated with the first line of our sales data. Seeing this, we think about our workflow and realize we haven't configured the Select Records tool properly. After we change its configuration to 4+, we rerun the workflow, and when we check the final result, we now see that our field names have populated according to our desired expectations. Before wrapping up this example, I want to point out something that might seem obvious, but it's so important in the context of us being CPAs that I think it's worth mentioning. Recall from earlier when we talked about errors, and specifically the Select Records tool generated an error because it wasn't configured properly. In other words, in the language of Alteryx, an error is something that causes a workflow to stop from fully processing. But for us as CPAs, an error is anything that's wrong with our data that might make its way into our final work products, such as financial statements, the tax provision, or a financial planning analysis. In this example, when the Select Records tool was configured as 5+, it didn't trigger an Alteryx error because 5+ is a valid configuration for the Select Records tool. But notice, and this is what's critical, our output was still wrong until we changed the configuration to 4+. The key takeaway is just because a workflow runs without Alteryx errors doesn't mean that the output itself doesn't contain errors. As CPAs, it's vital that we exercise due diligence in checking our work to ensure that it's accurate. Let's sum this up by reviewing it in the context of the scientific method. First, you need to determine what you're trying to accomplish with your data. What's your goal? Based on that goal, you identify and configure Alteryx tools to transform your data in a way that meets your objectives. From there, you run your workflow and check the results to see if your data processed according to your needs and expectations. If the answer is yes, you're done. But if you get an incorrect result, or if your workflow transforms your data in unexpected ways, you need to go back to step 1 and repeat the process until everything is working the way that it should. Now that we're getting near the end, let's talk about how you can continue to learn about Alteryx if you want to take things further. If you found this course to be helpful, I hope you'll look for my next one the same place you found this one. But what if it's not yet available? What can you do to get more of my content if that's of interest to you? First, I hope you'll give this course a good rating and leave that feedback with your CPE provider. Positive feedback is one of the things that creates demand for my courses, and so the better the feedback and the more people that take my courses, the more CPE I can produce. Second, you can go to my website and sign on to my professional education mailing list. That way you'll be automatically notified when I send out CPE-related announcements. Third, you can purchase my book, Alteryx for Accounting, Tax, and Finance Professionals, which is available on Amazon. Now, that won't give you CPE, but it does review most everything we went over today, and this fully illustrated 163-page book also contains a lot more information and examples about Alteryx tools and techniques specifically for CPAs that we didn't have time to cover during this course. Finally, if that still isn't enough, contact me directly and we can talk about potentially working out an on-site CPE course. I really appreciate you giving this course a try, and if you liked it, then I hope you'll join my mailing list and try my other courses as well. Thank you for attending.